Chapter 18, Home Sweet Home. The five looked on in dismay. "It didn't have to be like this," said Jonathan. "It was her choice," replied Ossian. "Her pride destroyed her in the end. But look at the price we had to pay." Suddenly there was a strange squawking sound coming from outside the window.
"Is it safe to come back yet?"
asked the strange green bird as she hovered into view.
"It's just that I have a passenger waiting to land."
How everyone cheered when a tiny sea serpent head popped up from its feathery nest on her back.
"Dada, Dada."
The confused creature gurgled as Staplehead lifted it down safely.
"Not likely,"
laughed the troll as he passed the child over to a very proud Ossian who could not speak with joy. After several minutes of hugging and backslapping, Jonathan asked, "What now?" In answer to his question, a dazzling light radiated from the mirror above the fire, and in the centre of the room stood the bronze-haired warrior that Princess Marina had described so well. There was no mistaking the brilliant blue eyes as he smiled appreciatively at his stunned audience. "You have done well, Jonathan," the warrior pronounced. "You have learned much for one so young. Power can be used honourably, or it can be used for greed. That is when evil steps in. You realize that forgiveness can be a mighty weapon, and that love really can conquer hate. I'm very proud of you. As you were so often told, the answer to your quest was already within you. You only had to find it." "But at what cost? Peck didn't deserve to die. Neither did Staplehead's father, for that matter. Just look at Princess Marina's face. Did they have to suffer just so I could learn a lesson?" asked Jonathan bravely, trembling slightly before this mighty being. The warrior thought carefully and nodded. Instantly, the princess's face was clear, no longer the crooked nose and limped hair. How she whooped with joy as she looked at her pretty face once more in the mirror.
Get me out of here!"
A muffled voice could be heard coming from deep within the cocoon of spider's silk, and soon Peck was flitting around the room trying to get the creases and wrinkles out of his wings. "And me, sir?" asked Ossian humbly. "I must return with my child, for soon others must be hatching, and only I can guide them safely to their new home." The blue eyes flashed and sparkled as Ossian returned to his true magnificent form. He was so big he filled the entire room, his tail lost down the maze of corridors. Barely able to turn his head, Ossian looked at Jonathan. "It has been a fine adventure. I will tell this tale for many a time to come. Maybe you will write about me in one of your tales, Jonathan, but make it one with a happy ending." "Don't worry," laughed Jonathan. "I've learned my lesson well." Nestling his child between his front legs, Ossian said his goodbyes to each in turn, and the princess kissed him on his giant snout.
"I shall miss you,"
she said. "And I will miss you." Facing the warrior, Ossian said, "We are ready." There was no puff of smoke or other theatrical effects. Ossian and his child simply disappeared back to the lake, where the rest of his children were eagerly awaiting his return, ready for the long journey ahead of them to Serpina, who was anxiously patrolling the fresh, clean waters of their home. Staplehead stepped forward and bowed. "Sir, you've returned Peck to life. Then surely you can return my father?" The warrior said nothing, but solemnly looked at the wood elf.
"I cannot come back, son,"
said the wood elf.
"It was my proper time to die. I'm only glad that my spirit had time to meet you once again. When I said to you that all I am is within that desk, I meant that all my skill as a craftsman was carved into that intricate detail. I loved my profession. I carved my heart and soul into that desk. I knew it was my very last masterpiece. When I was killed, my spirit entered into this wooden elf. so that I might have the opportunity to pass my knowledge on to you. But first, you had to find me. You have indeed earned your inheritance.
The wood elf hugged him, and Staplehead smelled the familiar aroma of his father's pipe smoke, and a warm feeling of love passed through him.
Use your skills wisely.
And the wood elf stepped back into his place on the front of the desk, his outstretched arms holding the brass locks that closed the lid firmly. I believe that there is a certain royal gentleman awaiting his desk for the palace library. It is time you delivered it to him. The warrior allowed the troll to say his farewells before transporting both he and the desk back to the deep forest from whence they had come. And you, young lady, he said softly but firmly, have very worried parents with half the kingdom out searching for you. I trust you are ready to go home.
Oh, yes, sir. I was stupid to run away from those who love me, and it was pointless to try to get my own back on Witch Brimstone, because it only led to more misery and heartache.
She turned to Jonathan.
I wish you could come with me. We'd have so much fun playing in the palace gardens. But I guess you want to return to your own parents.
At first, said Jonathan, I thought you were going to be a right royal pain in the neck. But I was wrong. Underneath it all, you really were very likeable. And taking himself completely by surprise, he leaned forward and kissed her. I hope we might meet again sometime.
I'm sure we will,
she said, a little flustered at his audacity, but she quickly forgave him. Going to the bookcase, she took down the golden box containing the fairy cloth and hitched it under her arm. Taking a step towards the warrior, she suddenly remembered Snot.
Would you like to come home with me?
She asked, and Snot looked around to see who she was talking to.
I mean you, dozy bird. But we'll have to think of a better name for you. Can't have anything called Snot in a royal palace.
Do you really mean it?
Flapped the bird excitedly.
Of course I mean it. I'm a princess, and I always mean what I say,
she said pompously, and Peck and Jonathan laughed, knowing that the princess hadn't really changed all that much. The strange green bird puffed out her chest and flew to the princess, perching on her shoulder.
Actually, I've always quite fancied being called Lulabelle.
The princess and the warrior exchanged glances and rolled their eyes.
I think we'll have to discuss this later,
giggled the princess, and they too disappeared back to her parents, who weren't quite sure whether to hug her with joy or punish her for the distress that she'd caused them. As to what they thought of Snot the bogey bird, we might never know. Just you and me now, Peck, said Jonathan. Where will you be going back to? Peck already has another assignment, said the warrior. He is a guide. I send him to those of you who have lost their way in life a little, to help guide you into making the right decisions in your lives. Unfortunately, sometimes not all the guidance in the world is enough for some people. You mean Peck knew all along how this would end? Asked Jonathan, astonished.
Not at all,
interrupted Peck.
I can only advise you. It's you who makes the final decisions.
And if I'd made the wrong decisions?
But, thankfully, you didn't.
May I ask one more question? The warrior nodded, knowing already what the question would be. Jonathan cleared his throat. Who are you exactly? You already know in your heart, was the reply. I have been given many names and many faces, but it is enough to know that I am the only one who can make all things possible. It is time now also for you to go home.
Goodbye, Jonathan,
said Peck.
We will no doubt meet often in your lifetime.
I shall look forward to that, smiled Jonathan. The warrior raised his staff, but Jonathan held up his hand to stop him. The warrior's blue eyes flickered. Where can I find you again? Asked Jonathan. If I need you. The warrior laughed out loud. I am all around you, Jonathan. You need only ask, and I am already there. Your journey here is over. I have only to send your ogre friends back to their village, and my job here is done. Jonathan gasped. I'd forgotten about them. Will you thank them for me? Jonathan held out his hand and smiled at Peck. The warrior too held out his hand, and as the two met, Jonathan found himself back on the street with a fence made from old doors, and he was peering through the window at the archaeological dig on the other side. Realizing he was holding something in his hand, he looked down and slowly opened his fingers, revealing 5 peppermint sweets sticking to the sweat on his palm. He had hardly enough time to gather his wits together when he heard a familiar voice calling his name.
Hey, Jonathan, there you are. We've been waiting at the school gates for you for ages,
said his best friend Michael.
How come you came this way home?
Jonathan stood in silence as Michael and Marie Crichton ran up the road towards him. All he could do was stand and smile, relieved that his ordeal was over.
What are you grinning for?
Asked Marie.
You look like the Cheshire Cat.
Oh, I'm just glad to see you both, he replied honestly. Marie and Michael looked at each other and shrugged their shoulders.
We've just been discussing the costumes we're going to wear to Mary's fancy dress party,
said Michael.
You should see mine. Mum's just finished it. I'm going as a goblin.
Jonathan looked up, his eyes full of surprise. Will you be a red goblin with a shiny breastplate, black boots, and a Mohican haircut?
How did you know?
Michael was a little annoyed that his secret had been spoiled. And you, Marie, will you be dressed as a princess from a fairy tale?
Why, yes,
she said.
I bet our mums have been talking again. It's not fair.
Never mind. I'm sure you'll look beautiful anyway, Jonathan smiled. Marie was shocked by this sudden compliment, but felt strangely pleased that it had come from Jonathan. Maybe he wasn't so bad after all. Michael just gave his friend a strange look, as if he had gone momentarily insane, but he was quite used to Jonathan doing weird and unexpected things. Jonathan was just about to check Marie's hair for the remnants of a dried worm when he heard another voice that he recognised, one that did not fill his heart with good cheer. I'm gonna thump you, Seagrove, yelled Billy Morgan, his boots making an ominous sound as they thumped along the pavement. Thought I wouldn't find you, didn't you, Squirt? Jonathan sighed heavily. Here we go again, he thought to himself, and he hitched up his trousers and marched towards the bully. Michael now knew Jonathan had completely flipped his lid, but Michael was also in the awkward position of should he run and hide, or should he stay to help Jonathan home after Billy had flattened him. Marie was panic-stricken and grabbed Michael's arm.
You've got to help him, Michael. Billy Morgan's going to kill him.
Sorry, Mary,
gulped Michael, somewhat ashamed.
It's 2 against 1. That's not fair.
Marie gave him a filthy look. Billy Morgan, meanwhile, was more than a little shocked when he realised that Jonathan was not running away, but was marching straight towards him. And the look of determination on Jonathan's face was not what he had expected. Jonathan now stood face to chest as Billy was about a foot taller. Look here, he said calmly. I've had enough of your bullying, and he prodded Billy on the shoulder with his finger. I've had a bad day so far, and you are the least of my problems. I've been nearly eaten by ogres, bitten to death by fluffy monsters, and almost boiled alive in a cauldron of slug slime. You, Billy Morgan, are nothing in comparison. Now, you either buzz off or we deal with this situation right now. Jonathan stood firmly, his arms raised in a boxing manner, his eyes fixed menacingly on Billy's. Billy stared disbelievingly at Jonathan. This was not the same boy he delighted in terrorising, and all of this gibberish about monsters and slug slime indicated that Jonathan was quite mad and best left alone. You're nuts, Seagrove, was all that he could find to say. With hands buried in his trouser pockets, he turned and slumped off back down the road, his ego somewhat deflated. Billy Morgan, Jonathan shouted. Yeah? We need a goalie for the football match tonight, and with hands the size of yours, I reckon you'd be pretty good. Do you fancy a game? Nobody's ever asked me to play before, Billy mumbled to himself, not sure if Jonathan meant what he said. That's because you're too busy trying to beat us up, said Jonathan. Do you think you'd make a good goalie, Michael?
Yeah, sure.
agreed Michael. Having Billy Morgan on their side was definitely a good idea. Kick off at 6 o'clock. Will you be there? Asked Jonathan. You bet, was the reply, and when Billy Morgan smiled, he looked almost human. Jonathan, Michael and Marie were more than a little relieved when they watched Billy almost skip down the road.
I think you made him very happy.
Smiled Marie.
I like that.
People aren't always the way that they appear. Maybe we're too quick to judge people by their appearances rather than who they actually are.
Have you flipped or something?
Asked Michael.
All of a sudden you're sounding intelligent and that worries me. Did teacher bash you over the head with something when you stayed behind after class?
Oh, it's a long story, laughed Jonathan. I'll tell you about it someday. Look, here comes Miss Finchley.
What, that old bird? Let's make fun of that stupid feathery hat she always wears.
But before Michael could open his mouth, Jonathan had already said hello to her. Nice to see the sun shining for a change, Miss Finchley, he said. But Miss Finchley made no reply. She merely fastened the buttons on her green, shapeless coat and waited for the sarcastic remarks to begin. I said it's a lovely day, Miss Finchley, said Jonathan, a little louder in case she was going deaf. She glowered at him suspiciously, but saw no hint of malice on his face.
Yes, it is,
she was forced to say. We're playing football tonight. Maybe you'd like to come. The more supporters we can get, the better. Miss Finchley narrowed her eyes and studied the three children. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Without a doubt, Jonathan was actually being polite.
Well, young man,
she finally said.
I might just do that. Get me out the house and all that.
Good, we'll see you there then. Jonathan turned to his friends to see them standing there with their mouths wide open. Come on, or I'll never get home at this rate.
Definitely weird,
Michael whispered to Marie.
Yes, but nice with it.
Nearing his home, Jonathan saw old Mr. Grey doing his usual act of holding up the traffic with his walking stick. Even from a distance, he could see the sparkle in the old man's brilliant blue eyes. Will you be coming to the match tonight? Jonathan shouted to him. Of course, he yelled back. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Wherever you are, Jonathan, I'll be right there beside you.
Jonathan?
Michael inquired.
What are you going as to Mary's fancy dress party?
Oh, I think I'll go as a warrior. You know, like a Viking with long flowing bronze hair, carrying a golden staff. Pity I've got the wrong colour of eyes, said Jonathan thoughtfully. Michael shook his head.
Might have known I'd get a stupid answer.
Anyone for a peppermint? Asked Jonathan. And they lived happily ever after. Or did they?